Today I'm going to be looking at a video from Matt Fradd's channel, Pints with Aquinas, on the Shroud of Turin.
Welcome to Pints with Aquinas. I'm here today with Father Andrew Dalton, who is an expert on the Shroud of Turin.
Matt Fradd had on an American priest, Andrew Dalton, who works on the Shroud of Turin, to talk about the scientific evidence for it.
But one of the theories was that this was a painting, and so this was pigment, either organic or inorganic. Maybe it's a dye, maybe it's an ink of some sort. Well, sweeping the whole shroud, you don't find any of that. Not a single dose of little dot or drop of pigment, organic or inorganic. No varnish, no dye, no directionality whatsoever with which some liquid is applied to the cloth. Even though the 2023 now, we don't have a micro laser capable of delivering a micro burn this precise. And so the obvious question is, how in the world did this come into being? Like, what's the genesis of this enigmatic image?
That's a good question to ask, like how did this come into being, or what could possibly be the explanation for it? But I feel like there's often this unwritten rule or assumption that if you can't find some particular explanation for it, then that by default proves your conclusion. And that's not something he's argued yet, but I just wanted to point it out, that saying like, oh, where could this come from, or how could this be explained, that so far is not an argument for really anything. That's an argument that we don't know, as he said.
I know that people are going to come in with these thoughts of, wasn't this disproved? So it might be helpful to show why that isn't the case.
Here shows some pictures. This is probably what you saw on Front Page News in 1988. Can you see the 1260-1390 exclamation part? That's the exclamation part that really, it just screams academic excellence and propriety, doesn't it?
Yes.
These same guys got, what's the number? I'm going to forget, like how many million in sterling they got for their new museum, like the next day. It's a matter of the public record. The moment this was published, they were able to build their new laboratory. Some stuff was very fishy from the start, but it's just the case that Front Page News everywhere was the Turin Shroud it's been proven to be a medieval fake.
Yeah, I don't like this practice of trying to kind of imply that this study was done for financial reasons. It should generally be your last resort to try to say that people were somehow motivated in bad faith, pun intended, to try to fake their results for whatever reason, for money or something like that. And even if it were true, I mean, if we're looking at biases, I would not want to introduce bias, but if Andrew Dalton wants to introduce bias here, I feel like it won't go well for him, because the vast majority of the people who work on the Shroud are part of a religion that massively biases them towards a certain type of result. They want this to be true. This would be like a huge confirmation of their own belief. It would probably win a bunch of converts to Christianity. It would provide like a smoking gun for, Christianity being proven true, etc., etc. I think it's very hard to argue that the religious scientists here would not be way more biased than any particular secular scientists they brought in to do some particular test. It's possible that secular scientists could be biased towards disproving it, but do you really want to stack that up against the idea that my eternal soul depends on this religion being true, and this artifact would be a resounding confirmation of this religion being true?
You have to realize that this is all the people that came together from the highest powered laboratories across America when they discovered that the Shroud encodes 3D information.
He's going to talk a little bit later about exactly what he means by encoding 3D information. I found this not that impressive, but wait till later for that.
to tell you what they came home with is more questions than answers.
Wow.
Because they don't tell you what it is. They tell you what it's not. They say it's not human artwork. It's not made by
It's like via negativa.
Exactly. It's they leave open this question of how it's made, and so that really does leave room for the theory that many, of course, Christians have proposed: is what if it's the natural effect of a supernatural event in the moment of the resurrection, whatever that looks like, that produced this image?
So I listened a little bit further on. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything, but that is pretty much all he said. The theory is that this is the natural effect of a supernatural event. He just finished telling us that the research team came back with more questions than answers, and that all of the information tells us what it's not. So I'm not sure how any of this could help a theory. In my experience, a lot of people with religious beliefs hold religion as this sort of jack of all trades, this very general idea about something happening, like supernatural events are completely explained or sufficiently described just by appealing to sort of general concepts and intuitions. When the resurrection occurred, that was a supernatural event, and that just caused light and high energy and unexplainable things, and this is just sort of the effect of that. The problem with thinking like this is that it can match basically anything that doesn't yet have an actual well-defined explanation. What he's putting forward here is not a hypothesis. It is a net that will catch anything that has not already been caught by current science. And it will take anything in this net and say, aha, that is evidence for my specific hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead, or my hypothesis that light emanated from Jesus, or supernatural light emanated from Jesus. It is not evidence for the supernatural if something can't be explained by science. Science is a collection of our current understanding of how things work. If you want to postulate something beyond how things work, if you want to postulate a divide between the natural and the supernatural, then you have to tell us how the supernatural works so that when we're confronted with a situation like this with the Shroud, you can tell us, oh, if this were supernatural, here's what I would expect to see. Here are the specific things that would happen that aren't just a general description of everything that isn't well defined.
Because you brought up a point a moment ago that needs to be, I think, re-emphasized, that at this point you don't have to believe this is a supernatural artifact.
That's right.
And so
someone
could agree that this is the shroud that
Yes.
covered the body of Jesus Christ and still not believe that Christ rose from the dead, that Christianity is true.
That is a great point by Matt Frad. Somebody can accept this and still not believe that Jesus, died for our sins or something like that. This kind of brings us back to what I said earlier, that the predictions here are not really well defined. Honestly, there really aren't any predictions exactly, except that we wouldn't be able to understand it with science.
And a lot of the talk and a lot of ink is spilt on radiocarbon dating and is it authentic? I think the better question to ask is, who is this man? Like, just here's the data, explain it, right? It's there. it demands an explanation.
This might not be like super relevant, but I've always found it weird how I hear like a lot from apologists. Oh, this cries out for an explanation. You know, this evidence demands like an explanation. Not all evidence is going to have a knockdown explanation. Sometimes there are things that happen that we just don't have all of the relevant data for. Any explanation we can come up with, given the data that we have, is not going to look good because we only have a small amount of the data involved with that. There are plenty of historical events and plenty of, say, unsolved murder cases, not because people have looked at the data and like they're not smart enough to pick out the right one. It's because the data doesn't always like cry out for an explanation, in the sense that if you look at it in the right way, there's a specific, correct explanation that is clearly much more likely than the other possible explanations. Sometimes stuff will just look weird. We shouldn't always expect to be able to find a perfect explanation. Sometimes some things will just remain uncertain, and it's okay to say, these are our best candidate explanations, but individually, none of them are very likely. You can have a situation where each individual explanation is unlikely, even if the probability of any of them being true is itself very likely.
And this is the question I like to ask my friend Barry Schwartz, because he's not a believer, and yet he travels the world talking about the authenticity of the Shroud.
So what does he think it is?
Well, this is what I ask him. I say, well, because he likes to give this great analogy, which I follow. Like he says, I think it's a Sherlock Holmes episode or like a little short story or something. It's something like this. Like if there are 5 theories on the table and 4 can be discarded or disproved, you can know, Watson, that the one that remains is surely true. And so it helped me.
When what is impossible is removed, whatever is left, however improbable, must be true.
As soon as Andrew Dalton mentioned Sherlock Holmes, I was worried he was going to reference this. This Sherlock Holmes idea is something that a lot of apologists use. C.S. Lewis used it. And it's this idea that whatever... I had to look up the phrasing. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. If you're not working with something like math, where you can have logically exhaustive possibilities, like it is either greater than 3, equal to 3, or less than 3, this is a terribly misguided idea. You don't have in your head all of the possible ways that something could happen. Usually, when you do have an idea of how something could happen, that itself involves a bunch of different things all happening together. Some of them might happen, some of them might happen in a slightly different way. The phrasing, the conception of each of the different possible explanations, it's all very, very vague. A lot of apologists use this basically to set it up as Christianity or God versus these naturalistic explanations, and they'll pick 2 or 3 just kind of general ideas of, you know, oh, the Shroud is fake, or, you know, the disciples made it up, or something like that. They'll take those and they'll say, oh, well, look, that's ridiculous, you know. The Shroud is, you know, is clearly, you know, dated to before whenever they said that it was dated to, or, oh, the disciples, obviously, you know, they wouldn't die for something that they made up. They knock down these alternate explanations, and then they say, there, see? Look what's left standing. Christianity. There is not always a likely explanation. If I give you a 20-sided die and you roll it, and I don't look and I don't see what you've rolled, and I have to guess it. You know what it is. I just have to guess between 1 and 20. The odds of any of the outcomes, the odds of any specific integer, inclusively between 1 and 20, are low. There is no single likely explanation given my knowledge about the situation. But the odds of all of the explanations together is 100%. The odds of 1 through 17 being the number, that's also very likely. So much of what makes different explanations likely or unlikely is exactly how you phrase them to make them include more or less of the possibility space. And it is very messy and very situational and very contextual just how much of the actual space of possibilities you're taking up when you say, here's God and here's Richard Dawkins or whatever. You need to consider the whole space, and that is almost impossible for me or Andrew Dalton or anyone else. Basically, all of that to say how likely Christianity is, or how likely it is that this is the real shroud that covered, the real historical Jesus, has almost nothing to do with how many of these scientific explanations you've knocked down. You haven't defined how many possible explanations there are, what the likelihood of each of them is, how many of them involve this being the real shroud. It is a way to play on the intuitions where we kind of set things up in an adversarial way, and we say, here's God and here's atheism, or here's science and here's faith, here's Republicans and here's Democrats, and we think if one of them takes a hit, that's kind of like in a fight, it means like the other guy is winning, and that's really not how it works. Like you can judge this without reference to how well anything else can explain it other than your hypothesis. You never see scientists in scientific articles who are arguing, say, for loop quantum gravity, say, look here, here's some of the best evidence for loop quantum gravity is that string theory, it's a complete mess. Look, that's obviously not true. So, that bumps us up.
But it does leave open the question. So it may be the case that we maybe tomorrow, and this wouldn't be a problem. Some people have pretended that Christians are out there saying that the case for Christianity rests upon the authenticity of the shroud. Like, we would sleep easy tonight if we got a new test saying, hey, you know what? The shroud is medieval, and it doesn't tell us anything about the sufferings. I think that would be kind of unfortunate. Like, I'm glad that there's
no way you would sleep easy if that was discovered, especially given what you've just shared about the pollen and the soil. Okay,
fair enough. I would be disappointed, but that is to say,
but it wouldn't
shake my faith in Christianity.
Shake the foundation.
So the case for Christianity doesn't rest on the shroud. It wouldn't be a big deal if the shroud were shown to not be the real shroud. Okay, so what is the prediction? What do we expect based on Christianity? It is not exclusively a science thing to have implications of beliefs that you can compare to the way the world is. That is a general thing. If Christianity is true, what is the probability? What is the expectation of what this shroud would be? If you would expect this to be the real Shroud of Turin, if you would expect that there would be a real shroud with all of the amazing properties that Andrew Dalton has mentioned, then mathematically, if it is shown that the shroud is not real, that lowers your credence in Christianity. You cannot have it both ways. This is how Bayes' theorem works. If you want to say, oh, if this is true, then this raises our credence in Christianity. That is the same thing as saying, if this is not true, it lowers our credence in Christianity. So you can either say this would be evidence for Christianity, or it would not be evidence for Christianity, or it is not evidence either way. I'm fine with any of those, but you have to tell me which one it is. You cannot just say, if, the shroud is proven to be fake, oh, well, that won't affect me at all. Like, that doesn't mean that Christianity is any less likely to be true. But if it's real, oh, well, then that, makes Christianity way more likely, because look, that's exactly what we would have expected. But if it's shown to not be real, oh, well, that's not really what you would expect anyway.
Our faith rests upon eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
And what I think is really cool, I mean, obviously we have Mary Magdalene, we had the first apostles, they tell their story. Some 500 saw him at one time risen from the dead. And so,
just to be clear, just as an aside, we have Paul saying that 500 people saw Jesus. This just counts as one person.
These people, when they had nothing to gain and everything to lose, they went to their death professing faith in the resurrection, when it was known to be false that people rise from the dead. Like, nobody in the ancient world believed such a thing, that people come back from the dead to live new, glorified, resurrected lives.
And when have there ever been any examples of people behaving irrationally in ways that are self-sabotaging up to and including leading to their deaths?
I was wondering, somebody in the chat asked what you mean by it encodes 3D information.
That's a good question. Yeah, so if you were to take a picture of me with your camera, it's obvious that the picture would show my white collar as white and my black jacket as black. So color doesn't correspond to distance information. This is not the case with the shroud. So where there's contact with the cloth, like where the nose sticks out or the chin sticks out, it's touching the cloth in such a way that the shroud is more densely colorized here at the nose. But imagine now the Adam's apple. It's going to be slightly distant to the cloth because it's draped over the chin, and now that gap means that there's less colorization. There is an inverse proportion between the density of image and the distance to the camera, which in this case is the cloth.
Yeah, so you've almost certainly seen something like this before. It's just a depth map a lot of the time is what it's called. You also get the same effect with maps. The color goes from like green to orange based on how high the elevation is at that point. Like the color or the brightness changes based on how far away the thing is supposed to be. I'll put an example of one of them up on the screen. I mean, it's a pretty basic thing. Suffice to say, I was a little disappointed when I heard encodes 3D information, and it was just a depth map.
I've seen enough crucifixes to be inured to it, to be desensitized to it. It's jewelry, it's decoration for my living room, and I can sip tea as I look at the cross. But this shakes me out of my complacence and says, look at what I suffered for you. He's taking upon himself all sins from the dawn of time to the end of the age. And this is the bitter cup that he's drinking to the dregs. And look at what it looks like. When he could have snapped his finger or like waved a wand and said, abracadabra, I save you, suffer a paper cut or something, right? But why this? He's stepping into a very unique set of sufferings, and he knows it, and he says amen anyway. Like, why in the world would you do that? I don't know, no human, no matter how heroic, that would step into such a thing. And yet there he is doing it for us.
That is actually a great question. Why this? If Jesus could have forgiven all of our sins without going through this, I would have preferred that. Assuming that this is true and assuming that there is real suffering here, I absolutely would not want someone to undergo horrible torture and a slow, unimaginably painful death just so they can say, look, like, I got tortured for you. This is one of those things where I feel like in any other context, it would probably be seen as crazy. I don't want to say that the religious belief itself is crazy, but I really don't see the benefit of this, of voluntarily being tortured to show his love is just not what I would have in mind for how someone should express their love. I don't think that's a healthy or a particularly useful way to express your love for someone. I would not voluntarily cut off my arm and show somebody that I loved to profess to them how much I loved them. If it were necessary, I think that's understandable. But if this is just for purpose of communicating a message, I don't really see the purpose, and I think that this is a very good example of something that would have seemed obviously like a great and normal and very noble thing to do for people living in that place at that time, and very obviously wouldn't seem great or noble to us in any other context now.
I want, like Jesus with St. Thomas the Skeptic, to say, come, press and probe. Put your hand, Thomas, in my side. Press and probe. Hey, you scientists, come with your microscopes and all your X-ray and infrared and all the rest. Study the Shroud. But don't be unbelieving, but believe.
I think that's a good segue into something else I wanted to say. Andrew Dalton is saying, look, the scientists should all come with their instruments and their tools, and they should look and inspect and test it and see that this stands up to scientific scrutiny. So what should we expect if it really is the case that Jesus, presumably intentionally, left behind a shroud that, of course, he knew people would find and people would inspect with scientific instruments? What are the implications of that? The implication seems to be that God is fine with giving us scientific evidence for supernatural events, like the most important supernatural event, the resurrection. So then, why is this the only thing we have? So you need to consider all of the implications of a hypothesis. What implications will it have for what you expect to see in the world? If we think that God is willing to leave behind pieces of evidence for scientific inspection, presumably with the idea that that this would probably convert people, why aren't there artifacts all over the place that are, radiating holy energy, that just have powerful holy auras of grace and make all of our scientific instruments go haywire? How are we to understand that, given the fact God is perfectly willing to leave us scientific evidence for Christianity, that we are all left here trying to find something that can serve as evidence? And we found the shroud, but oh man, they tested, the wrong part of it, and looks like that part was added on later. Maybe if we carbon date it again, we'll get a better idea of it. Doesn't really look like we have a clear idea of what created this, but we'll keep looking at it. Why is all of this necessary? Most of the stuff that we encounter in our everyday lives is just immediately apparent. That doesn't mean that Our free will is being overturned. It doesn't mean we're being forced to fall at the feet of whatever it is and worship it as God. It just means that we know that it's real. Why can't we have good definitive evidence? Even if the Shroud were proven, like tomorrow, why were we only given a piece of evidence that Jesus knew due to all of these circumstances and history was only going to end up being demonstrated to be true 2,000 years after the fact? This seems to raise more questions than it answers. I'm going to quote one of my favorite physicists, Sean Carroll, here, that this is not some sophisticated explanation for exactly what could have produced this shroud. This is an admission of defeat. This is basically saying that I have no idea what would be produced if there were a resurrection. All I know is that, it would be some kind of thing that science couldn't explain, and it would be impressive and possibly connected in some way to the general area of ancient Palestine. If we want to do science, as Andrew Dalton has been saying, that this is real science, he wants to really treat this like a real scientific question. This hypothesis that he has put forward would be laughed out of the room by any group of scientists, any unbiased, serious group of scientists. It doesn't predict anything. It doesn't help us figure out how things work. If all you have is your belief that Jesus rose again, and all you want to do is confirm that belief, sure, you can feel more confident that Jesus rose again if that is your personal religious preference. But this does nothing for actual science, because in actual science, we want to understand what happened. What exactly are you saying happened? At some point, the physical stuff that we have now and the supernatural stuff connected. They interacted somehow. This stuff was caused by a supernatural event. There is some chain of things happening that at some point goes from supernatural to natural. And when that happens, we want to know what actually occurred. What is the interaction? If your explanation for how it works is just that it's supernatural and it was really holy and Jesus is Lord, then I'm not that interested, at least not in the sense of science. Because in science, what we want to understand is how things work. We don't just want to put a label on the fact that something happened. We want to describe the structure of that thing. We want to describe its inner workings. The problem is that a lot of people already have all of the information they want and need about what happened. And all they want to know is, it happened in the way that I think it did. Anyway, that's about all I wanted to say about this video. It was very long and I'm tired, so don't forget to subscribe. I'm just kidding. Thanks for watching.